only trust that we can have is in our own minds and our own research and our own critical faculties to sort the true from the false.
You're listening to Catalyst Talks, conversations with change agents, outliers, superheroes, and truly conscious leaders modeling what it is to be an unstoppable force for good in this world. What lit these catalysts on fire to do their work, and what nuggets of wisdom can they share with a world literally on fire? This podcast is for you who cares deeply and seeks to catalyze the world. I'm your host, Stephanie Trager. I'm a consciousness catalyst and soul coach to superstar change agents in business, leadership, and life. In this podcast, I wear an eclectic mix of hats, including Earthkeeper, healer, mindset coach, lawyer, business, sustainability, and impact strategist. My intention is holding space for higher purpose, peak wellness, and soul mastery so we can live in harmony with ourselves, each other, and nature. The whole idea of Catalyst Talks in these conversations is to awaken consciousness, unlock higher purpose, and learn what it really takes to catalyze change in that scale. Subscribe to our new podcast and help us grow. We're aiming to reach 1 million people at least in 2020. Let's wake up the world together. My guest today is Nadine Strossen, a very special shiro of mine, and I'm so excited for you to listen to this whole episode, listen to the whole thing. There's so much good wisdom in here. Nadine was a constitutional law professor of mine in law school. She was also my professor for international human rights. This was way back when I was at New York Law School. She's now the John Marshall Harlan Professor Emerita at New York Law School. And when I was in school, I served as her research assistant. She had a team of research assistants, and I was in her loved one's pod. And we were serving her in her role as the constitutional law professor, but also in her role as the president, the then standing president of the American Civil Liberties Union. For those international listeners, it is one of the most powerful civil liberties organizations in this country. Nadine served as president, the first woman president, from 1991 to 2008, 18 years. She's a leading expert, frequent speaker, media commentator on constitutional law and civil liberties. She's testified before Congress on multiple occasions. She serves on many advisory boards now, including the ACLU. The National Law Journal has named her as one of America's 100 most influential lawyers. Several other publications have named her one of the country's most influential women. She's received many honorary degrees and awards. You can see her full bio in the show notes. And one of the things I love to say is when I was working as a research assistant in Nadine Strossen's office in the early 2000s, around the time of 9/11, it was pretty active, and we would be answering emails from Supreme Court justices. And in fact, Supreme Court justices participated in her farewell tribute luncheon when she stepped down from the ACLU as president. Those include Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Scalia, and Souter. Strossen's 2018 book, Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship, has earned praise from diverse experts, and it is something that we talk about in today's episode. So stay tuned for the whole thing. You will be inspired. Nadine is one firehouse, and she has a lot of wisdom to share. Nadine, thank you so much. It is such an honor to have you here on Catalyst Talks podcast. And I mentioned in the intro that you were my constitutional law professor at New York Law School. And at the same time, I was part of your loved one's team of research assistants years ago. Truly a pivotal experience in my life because you were at that time also the president of the ACLU. And for those international listeners we have, that's the American Civil Liberties Union, where you served for 18 years as the president. So I want to kick us off here by going back in time before we step into this present moment, what we're currently experiencing, and let's do some context setting around how we got here. My first year in New York Law School was welcomed by 9/11, and the school was 8 blocks away. For many of us, we were commuting through Ground Zero, and that was a huge mark on that incoming class and our experience of civil liberties and the law. And my second year, I was in your con law class and joined your team of RAs, of research assistants. And you left such a deep impression on me because back then we were dealing with the blow from 9/11 and you were such a badass. This woman with strong opinions. You're so smart. It was mind blowing for me, really. I wondered, how am I ever going to be that smart to make a difference? And the one thing I remember was that you could duke it out with energy that wasn't always bringing the light. And you were literally warded off with an intellectual sword. And at that time, you were challenging the Patriot Act and testifying before Congress, and I was answering emails from Justice Scalia. It was an amazing moment. And I want to know from you what it means to actually wield power that defines truth, because that is what is unfolding now, and that is what I see you doing.
That is such an amazing question, Stephanie. And this is a fantastic reunion because you were such an outstanding student and research assistant. And it's been a joy to see you speaking truth to power and wielding your power to advance truth in many inspiring ways since you graduated from law school, including through this really important podcast, which I am so delighted to be part of. And I think I'm going to start answering that question by using the 9/11 example to illustrate, since you reminded us of that. It was an unprecedented experience, certainly in all of our lifetimes, but even in American history. To this day, we use the phrase pre-9/11, post-9/11. It was what to use a cliche, but is accurate, a paradigm shift in terms of Americans' sense of danger, of an existential threat to their individual lives and to the very notion of the country hanging together. Civil liberties were endangered in not an unprecedented way, but in an extremely intense way, which accompanies every actual or perceived threat to national or personal security. And that is, people suddenly become completely enthusiastic about giving up even what would have been their most cherished rights in a desperate search for safety. And especially, they are willing to give up the rights of other people. In that period, we saw just horrific assaults on the rights of people solely because of who they were, without any evidence at all that they had done anything illegal, let alone commit a terrorist act. And so swept up and hidden away in secret incarceration, unknown, their location was unknown even to their families, even to their lawyers, were people who were rounded up for one reason only, that they were young Muslim immigrants from South Asia or the Middle East. And the ACLU came to the defense of their fundamental rights in a way that virtually nobody did. And that made us subject to attack as terrorists and unpatriotic and subversive and threats to the national security. I was very shocked because I got so much hate mail at New York Law School, including messages that were slid under my office door or taped to my office door. And Stephanie, as you recall, we had extremely tight security then. So the only people who could gain admission to New York Law School facilities were members of the New York Law School community. So I knew that it was some of my students or some of my faculty colleagues or staff members who were accusing me of being a terrorist because I was insisting, as was the whole ACLU, on preserving and respecting fundamental rights even of people who are accused, especially when there's absolutely no evidence against them. And this is really this is what truth is to me. This is what leadership is to me. Not to toot my own horn, I was one of countless people within the ACLU and other human rights organizations who were taking these extremely unpopular positions. But you have to stick to principle. You have to have the courage to do that when it is very unpopular, when it is feared, when people will attack you falsely but fervently as being all kinds of terrible things, including anti-patriotic and threatening other people's safety and security. And you just have to keep your eye focused on what is I keep using the word fundamental, and to me that resonates with your word truth. We have this central core value to which we are true and which demands that we speak the truth and not be deferred or deterred or deflected because of even enormous political pressure, even enormous emotional fear.
There's two paths I want to go on from there. One is exploring where you became this courageous leader. How did that begin? And then there's also this incredible opportunity to dovetail into this moment we're in today. So let's come back to the leadership question and dive into, how do you see this very experience playing out today?
It's playing out today in that it's the very same issues, but with different factual contexts. And I think that's always the case, Stephanie. The principal founder of the ACLU, a wonderful social worker named Roger Baldwin, said, "No fight for civil liberties ever remains won." And what he meant by that was, you may win a battle and for you, it's establishing a principle or reaffirming a principle. But, a few days later or a few years later, the very same battle has to be refought because the facts are slightly changed and because people say, well, this is new, this is different. A phrase that you may recall I used in constitutional law because it's constantly relevant, is historical hubris, and the counterpart is historical humility. Every generation seems to believe that, it's the center of the universe and whatever threat it is facing now is the newest, biggest, most alarming, completely different from everything else that went before, so different in degree that it becomes different in kind, and lacks the humility to learn that we have made the same mistakes over and over and over again, demonizing the same marginalized people, including immigrants, every time there is a national security problem. So what lesson did we learn from World War II, when even such a venerated icon of liberalism and human rights as Franklin Delano Roosevelt is responsible for interning more than 110,000 Japanese Americans, including many citizens, when there was no evidence that any of them had engaged in actual espionage or sabotage. So 9/11 rolls around and we have the unsubstantiated imprisonment of people who are rounded up only because of who they are. We invoke the precedent of the Japanese American internment, and people say, oh, no, we admit that was a mistake, but this time it's different because everybody knows that all of the 9/11 terrorists and all terrorists in recent history have been from the Middle East, and they've all been Muslims, so this time it is justified. And in fact, some of the TV networks even identified survivors of the Japanese internment camps who came on TV, and they said, of course, we were opposed to that racially based imprisonment and deprivation of rights. But this is different. These people really are dangerous. So we have to take a step back and realize that you have to keep your eye on the fundamental principle, not allow yourself to be deterred by the different factual context in which it arises.
So in the moment we're in where COVID is a reality and there's a narrative on mainstream media, and it's a similar thing, right? There's a narrative around who the terrorists are. There's a narrative around what actually happened. And just like from the beginning of time, this whole thing is a made up story, including the Constitution. And here we are today where it's never been as well, maybe not. This is a historical moment of historical humility. I was about to say, never before has it been this obvious that that the way social media and Google and online platforms are controlling how we gather and experience information, how this borders on on our First Amendment rights when these are private companies that are literally, impacting free and fair elections. They're impacting our First Amendment rights to dissent and share, differing opinions and it's a function of national security, or maybe it's not, but around COVID, if you're sharing any fake facts, then you're a terrorist, right? You're a conspiracy theorist, and we're wiping you off the internet.
Yeah, you're raising very serious issues, but to me, this is another example of we've seen this before repeatedly throughout history. Yes, every time a new, more powerful, less expensive medium is invented that is accessible to more people, it's got all the advantages that are associated with that wonderful new opportunity for more people to communicate with more other people, but it also has the disadvantages because we human beings are capable of great good, but we're also capable, sadly, of great evil and great harm, and communications are part of both processes. So I can tell you, Stephanie, even during my adult lifetime, I have seen repeated attacks on whatever was the newest medium of the time being blamed for whatever was the most feared or a significantly feared social problem at the time. So, for example, when we had the first school shootings, this was slightly before you became a student. I mean, it's not, to me, that's shockingly recently that we had our first school shooting. Now, sadly, you can hardly keep track of them. But because the school shooters had played violent video games, suddenly those were, and that was a fairly new phenomenon, and so those became blamed for instigating school shootings and violence on the part of young people. At the time of the Oklahoma City bombing, around the same time, slightly earlier, which was before 9/11, that was the biggest terrorist attack on U.S. soil. So-called hate radio was blamed for that because there were these radio stations that were attracting and pandering to right-wing anti-government conspiracy theory militia movements. And I remember Bill Clinton was president, and he gave radio addresses probably on National Public Radio, right, against so-called hate radio. When the internet first came to public attention, long before social media were invented, there was at that time a lot of concern about child sexual abuse. A lot of notorious cases had come to attention. Later, it turned out that quite a few of them were fabricated, but there was this real fear, and one has to say even hysteria, about that particular problem. And so the internet was attacked, and the World Wide Web was attacked because this could facilitate abuse and exploitation sexually of children. Time magazine even had a cover, just a frightening cover, which I can picture in great detail, of a computer screen. And this was when most people had just heard of the internet for the first time, and Congress had just heard of it for the first time. And it shows this ugly, evil monster leaping out of the computer screen and attacking children. And so it's not surprising that Congress greeted the internet with a very strong censorial law censoring all sexual expression, which fortunately the Supreme Court struck down. So to me, it's like more of the same. Yes, social media are even more powerful than the World Wide Web and all the other antecedents. But let us not forget that a lot of that power has been used for extraordinarily positive purposes. There's no way we would have had a Me Too movement without social media. There's no way we would have had a vibrant Black Lives Matter movement without social media. There's no way that Barack Obama's candidacy for president, not to mention the local candidacies for, seats in Congress all over the country and local governmental bodies by young people, by immigrants, by minority religions, by women. Many progressives are completely dependent on social media for running viable campaigns. They no longer have to depend on getting fat cats and corporations to bankroll humongously expensive campaign ads on broadcast media. So, it's always popular to emphasize the negative. I think we have to keep our eye on the positive and ask ourselves, how can we use the First Amendment, including our First Amendment rights, to advocate and petition and to engage in our own expression, to emphasize the positive potential of social media and to rein in the negative potential.
And how can we do that right now? Many people will say that, well, the First Amendment doesn't apply because these are private companies.
We can use our First Amendment rights to engage in free speech as long as these companies allow us to do that. And you're absolutely right that they have a prerogative as private sector entities to decide that they want to kick us off. But we have power as consumers to raise our voices, and including not only individually, but banding together. So about a month ago, there was a series of boycotts that were being advocated by various users. They were targeting Facebook in particular, objecting to Facebook allowing on what was considered to be hate speech or disinformation, controversial expression. And, just individuals, probably some celebrities were involved, but also a lot of social justice activists, Black Lives Matter activists, other protest movements used the power of persuasion and the power of customers to not only have meetings with Facebook to demand changes in its policies, but also to organize boycotts or advocate boycotts, which were actually undertaken by a number of major advertisers on Facebook. And that definitely led Facebook to change its content moderation policies. Now, I want to put myself on record as saying, I don't necessarily advocate those changes. I think they may cause more harm than good, but I'm responding to your point that just because we don't have a First Amendment right to be allowed to speak on Facebook's platform does not mean that we don't have a lot of influence by raising our voices in the ordinary political process.
It is an interesting moment when private companies are acting as governments in a way, right? There's clearly interference with elections, and Google, if you've seen the movie The Creepy Line, I recommend everyone see that movie. It's pretty interesting how our gathering of information is very much censored. And
I haven't seen that movie, and thank you for recommending it. I did see another one. I can't remember. I think it was called The Circle or some such thing, which was also, I use Google, so I know how creepy it is, right? Because on the one hand, you like it. I was doing a search about something very complex, and basically you type in the first three letters of the first word of like a 10-word request, and it pops up. It's like they can read your mind. And there is something really horrific about it's not only that these are dominant platforms that have seemingly monopoly power about information that you are seeking, but also when you are seeking to communicate for all practical purposes, they have this gatekeeper power. That is not unprecedented, Stephanie. In the dark ages, when I was growing up, there were only 3 major TV networks. 3 TV networks, period. And you can imagine how extraordinarily difficult it was for an ordinary person, or for that matter, even a celebrity, even a political candidate, to have any portion of that extremely limited airtime. For all practical purposes, it was impossible. So the fact that there are gatekeeper functions being performed by the Facebooks and Twitters of the world, I mean, the fact of the matter is that a vast majority of people who seek to have accounts and who seek to post comments or communications on those platforms are able to do so infinitely more than could have done so in any other media era. And as the Supreme Court said in that landmark case in which the ACLU successfully persuaded the court to unanimously strike down Congress's attempt to censor the internet, never before can every single person have the power to communicate with every other person all over the entire world. Now, what I think is different, as I alluded to and as you brought up with the Google example, is the invasion of privacy, the subjecting all of us to algorithmic, first of all, extracting information without our consent, engaging in what some people have called surveillance capitalism, right? We think we're getting these services for free, but of course we're not. We're selling access to our thought processes because they monitor all of our online activities, which paint an infinitely more detailed portrait of not only what we do, but who we are, what our beliefs are, what our associations are, what our interests are by following everything that we do online. And this is where COVID makes an already enormous problem even more enormous, because now we're leading more of our lives online than ever before, a huge percentage. And all of this is done without any consent, without any information, without any transparency, without any accountability. And then, to add great insult to great injury, algorithms are used to drive certain information to us and certain communications to us based on these complex portraits that have been built of us. So we think, I think that I'm making an independent search, or I think that I'm getting a news feed that is independently put together, but in fact it is tailor-made to manipulate, to take advantage of the thought processes that they're aware of and to manipulate them even further. And that is just the most profound violation of not only individual privacy, but also associated with that, individual freedom of thought, right? Thought processes are being surveyed and manipulated. And this is a huge problem. And I hope it's something that Congress, which is starting to have some hearings into some of these issues, will get a grip on.
Most people don't even recognize that it's happening at this level of surveillance capitalism. And even if they do, or we do, because I find myself in the flow of this too, it's sometimes this like a spell of cognitive dissonance where you're like, it, but you're doing it anyway.
Because it's so convenient, right? And you are in the moment, especially, are willing to give up what seems rather abstract for some very concrete advantage. And it's fairness. What choice do we have? Now, I made what seemed to me to be a very big, significant choice many years ago when, guess what? I have never joined a single, or whatever the verb is, I don't even know, never become a member of any social media platform at all. Not Facebook, not Twitter. I can't even name what the other. I mean, I do use Google, that's for sure, but I don't use social media. And the reason, Stephanie, was at the outset when I heard about these new platforms, I thought, that seems to me to be a danger to privacy. And never in my wildest imagination could I have even dreamed of what just a humongous threat to privacy it was. Now, as I say, that seemed to be a big decision, and to this day, I know that I'm in a small minority of people my age range not being on Facebook, and I know it's inconvenient, and when people want me to know about certain events, they have to go to the trouble of emailing me if they can remember. And I'm so glad that I did it, but now I understand that I'm still subject to surveillance by those companies by virtue of interacting with somebody who is a member of their community. So you can't even protect yourself by choosing not making an affirmative choice. They still can get their tenterhooks into you.
Sorry if I'm exposing you in any way, shape, or form right now. Well, one of the cogent points you made in your recent book, your book from a few years ago, Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship, speaks to this point of building resilience. Like, we're all being attacked on some level, right? And I would love to hear if you can, let me just say there's this quote that really stood out to me, quote, that we have to build critical listening and learning skills so we don't unthinkingly accept information or ideas to which we are exposed, and how counter speech can help prevent or redress the potential harms of hate speech. And I brought that quote in here because it feels very apropos right now. It's if people are being censored because they have an opinion about, just say, COVID or something that is not agreed, it's not the mainstream narrative, and it's being wiped off the internet. Mm-hmm. Isn't it more powerful that we can listen and accept information or ideas to which we're exposed and then assert counter speech? How do you see the overlap between hate speech and this form of censorship we're experiencing right now?
Oh, absolutely. The same general problems, fundamental problems, going back to that word, with censorship as a purported remedy for speech that can do harm. Those problems exist no matter what the nature of the particular speech is, or no matter what the nature of the particular harm is that it's feared the speech can cause. So the very reason why I oppose censorship of so-called hate speech is the same reason why I oppose censorship of disinformation or misinformation, and the same reason why I oppose censorship of so-called terrorist or extremist expression, which is also a big target of suppression, not only in the United States, but around the world. And why? Because it is feared that this kind of speech can lead to hatred and discrimination, including discriminatory violence. It can lead to undermining our elections and spreading public health problems, and it can lead to terrorist attacks, respectively. I do not oppose censorship because I dismiss the potential harm of this speech. No, all of that speech can influence people to adopt negative, dangerous, harmful ideas, which can persuade them, motivate them to commit harmful, dangerous, violent acts, and undermine safety for individual people, equality for individual people, and even threaten national security. So the only reason why I strongly oppose censorship is that it is not effective as a remedy for the potential harms that speech can do. So Stephanie, starting with, I keep using the adjective potential harms. Speech doesn't necessarily cause harm because it to do so. And let me use that old nursery rhyme, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. That is not literally true. Words hurt us all the time, right? People say things that hurt our feelings, that undermine our dignity, that break our heart, that wound our pride, et cetera, et cetera. But the reason why our parents told us that nursery rhyme was to instill in us a resolve that we were not going to let the words have that power over us, right? We would rise above it. We would be resilient. We would look down on the person who was trying to insult us. In my book, I have this wonderful quote from Eleanor Roosevelt in this context when she says, and I'm going to paraphrase it, I'm sorry, Eleanor, I can't remember your exact words, but the idea was, people cannot hurt you by what they say unless you allow them to do that. You give them the power by being hurt by what they say instead of rising above it and looking down on them.
This is really a wonderful moment because actually that is the page that is open in the book on my desk.
Oh,
No,
you can tell me the exact quote, please.
no one can make you feel inferior without your consent.
Without your consent, yes. And now, to the bigger issues, when we get beyond the emotional harm that words can do, the harm that it can do by instilling negative ideas, which might lead to violent conduct and so forth, or to, disinformation, making people take undue risks or undermine electoral behavior, undermining democracy. There we get to the kind of response that you were referring to, which is often called, kind of a quaint term, media literacy, or sometimes it's called critical media analysis. There is no way that we can depend on any social media company. This is why I said I had some reservations about boycotts against Facebook, asking it to take down more posts or to put up more labels, because that's just a Band-Aid. There's no way that you are going to shut up, silence every conspiracy theory, every fraudulent, false information, every misleading statement. It'll just go elsewhere. If it's not on one social media site, it will be on another. So there's no way that I hope that we in this democracy would trust any government censor to protect us against all dangerous speech, right? The only trust that we can have is in our own minds and our own research and our own critical faculties to sort the true from the false. And if you read anything, and even the most reputable source about a subject that you know about, there are always some inaccuracies, right? Sometimes they're relatively subtle, but the reporter is not going to be able to get down all of the facts. And so I think the only actual safety that we have against disinformation and all of the other potentially negative kinds of speech is to really raise everybody's understanding of their responsibility to have the resources available, fact checking, to know how to go to the primary sources, to have a healthy skepticism about everything they read. And I have to say, just using myself anecdotally, because of all of the publicity in the last few years about so-called fake news, I've become much more vigilant. I will not assume that anything I read is actually factually correct. And I do a lot of fact checking myself. There too is a great advantage in the internet, Stephanie, right? You can go to primary sources so easily. You can find reputable sources. You can find fact checking sources so easily. But if I do an interview and if I were citing something to you that I said, I read this today in the New York Times or Fox News, I'm not trying to make this a partisan comment, I would then say, but I haven't had a chance to check it yet, right? Because the fact that it's there, it may be true, it may not be true. And, I had a really interesting example of this recently, and it relates to Facebook and a former ACLU colleague of mine, Laura Murphy, a wonderful civil rights activist who's now specializing in doing civil rights audits of online companies. She did the audit of Airbnb for its civil rights violations and recently issued the third report about Facebook, being quite condemnatory of Facebook from her perspective and that of many other civil rights activists, not doing enough to take down racially discriminatory and other discriminatory posts. And somebody was interviewing me about the report the very day that it came out. And I said to the reporter, I said, I haven't had time to read the report yet. It just came out. All I've read are media descriptions of what it says. And I'm so happy that reporter actually quoted me saying that. Strossen said that she did not know what the report itself actually said, but based on media accounts. And then it turned out that the media accounts were really quite inaccurate about what the report actually said. I mean, I went and I read the report itself. So a healthy skepticism is necessary. On the other hand, one of those phrases that came up again and again in our common law course was a delicate balance, right? So the delicate balance is we should have what I call a healthy skepticism about everything we encounter on any medium, not only social media, but we don't want to be so overly skeptical that we denounce the media as the enemy of the people. That, I think, is very dangerous because the media as an institution, and I include, the whole wonderful panoply, including your podcast, as part of the media that is so important in our democratic republic that it has often been called the fourth estate, right? Everybody knows the three branches of the federal government, legislative, executive, and judicial. But the fourth estate is right up there as part of the checks and balancing process. And we don't want to allow the media to be so demonized that they can no longer serve effectively that essential function of holding, truth to power, right? Shining the spotlight on those that we elect to be accountable to us, the people. We can't do that if we don't have media providing information to us.
I love this whole thread because it keeps coming back to wielding power that defines truth. I also came up with a great sequel to your book, Fake Facts, Why We Should Resist with Free Speech, Not Censorship.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I really love how you're reminding everybody that we are responsible for, really finding our own truth, because what we're reading is determining our beliefs, our mindsets, the paradigms we live by, our assumptions about truth. And I'm finding my own experience when I find that the things that I look for are deleted. They're no longer there. And the author is like, what just happened? Why did my whole account get, I was just sharing like an opinion or another factual truth.
You were giving an example in the health field that even if something is, maybe especially if something is false, we want it to be there out in the open so we have a chance to refute it because we know people are going to be getting access to it. And one of the reasons why censorship, no matter how well intended it is, always ends up doing more harm than good is that when something is attempted to be silenced, the actual impact is to amplify it. It will get more attention than it otherwise would have, and it will get more sympathy than it otherwise would have. This is such a common phenomenon, Stephanie, that there are at least 3 different terms that are used for it. One is the forbidden fruits effect, right? It has the allure, oh, I'm not allowed to see that. Oh, I'm interested. So, for example, in the 90s, there were some censorship of art exhibits and art museums and obscenity prosecutions against them for the first time in U.S. history. And people who had never been to an art exhibit in their life had never been interested in going to an art exhibit. They're told it's obscene and they're not allowed to go, and suddenly they're lining up around the block to get in there. And another term that's used is the boomerang effect, right? Because you think you're accomplishing one thing, suppressing the message, but actually it comes right back at you and it just amplifies the message. And then a third term that's used is the Streisand effect, because a while ago, the celebrity singer Barbra Streisand tried to get photographs of her Malibu beach house taken down off the internet, and suddenly, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people were looking at those photographs who had never looked at them before. So I had to laugh because there was some recent incident that I read about where Facebook was taking down, I guess maybe it was YouTube, because it was a video of a press conference in front of the Supreme Court of doctors who were all there without masks, who were debating, disputing how safe it was for kids to go back to school, and basically saying that it's much safer, and we're getting misinformation about how cautious we should be about reopening schools. And I looked at that video, and there's no way I would have looked at that video because, we're getting so much information and disinformation. I was overloaded. There's no way I would have picked that particular video to look at unless I had heard that it was being censored. And so I wanted to see what is the justification for censoring this. And I have to say, it really made me very suspicious. You know, these look like credible people. These are all doctors. They all have frontline experience in dealing with actual patients. Why are their ideas considered so dangerous that they have to be censored? And that's exactly, you know, and I did some follow-up research, but I can imagine a lot of people stopping there and saying social media companies are, you know, so fearful of this truth getting out. Why else would they want to suppress it? Because if it is false and it's falsifiable, then, you know, why don't they just prove that it's false instead of denying us access? So again, I understand the motivation, but let's look at how it actually works or actually does not work.
Yes, I know that video. This is one of the things that I have been just diving into is I am looking for alternative facts because I'm kind of piecing together my own belief about what is going on. I might not believe necessarily what mainstream media is or the narrative is, and I am doing my due diligence, and some things I find plausible and I'm pulling together, then they're disappearing. And that is making me I question that. And then I'm called a conspiracy theorist. It's just an interesting thing that goes on with a narrative that is, whether it's true or not, being disseminated in the mainstream minds who are not people who are not questioning it.
And a lot of it is, you know, you tend to use these bifurcated, oversimplified terms, true, false, fake, actual, when a lot of it is just much more, infinitely more nuanced, subject to interpretation. I mean, credible scientists who may agree about a lot of things can still disagree about even what the relevant questions are, what are all the factors, what are a good experimental design. I mean, these are very nuanced and detailed subjects. And so it's not a matter of black and white. It's a matter of like more than 50 shades of gray, right?
I love that. Thank you for that, because it really is a reminder we are living in multidimensional reality where there are more than one truth, right? We all might have our own truths, and that's what we're navigating. How do we coexist in harmony with different worldviews and truths, right?
And you're exactly right, Stephanie, because first of all, we don't even know what all of the relevant factors are now. We're getting, the more information you have, the more, you know, each piece of information, each piece of experience rounds out the picture. We are far from having the whole picture here. But even assuming hypothetically we were at a state where, you know, 100% of scientists agreed on what the pertinent facts are and what the pertinent risks are, each of us as an individual will relate to that in a different way because we have different levels of risk averseness, different preferences for how much we want to take what is a risk in terms of what the alternative countervailing benefit is.
That's the perfect segue into what were some of the contributing factors to your risk tolerance. And again, I'm curious to know like how you became this courageous leader and how that part of you emerged. So what was it like for you stepping into your leadership, say growing up or in college, out of law school, just out of law school, at being the first woman to lead the ACLU for many, many years? And I just want to also highlight one quote that also from your book, Hate, Why We Should Resist It with Free Speech, Not Censorship, which is, we should develop thicker skin on behalf of ourselves and thinner skin on behalf of others, end quote. So how did you develop your thick skin?
Thank you so much. It was actually very easy to be president of the ACLU, and I don't give myself any kudos for courage in that capacity, Stephanie, because then you have a whole organization behind you, a large organization with many talented, dedicated people with a long history, and you're not just a lone individual who's standing up in the wilderness on your own without support. And that's why when people try to praise me, or even ACLU lawyers or staff members on the ground who are handling particular cases, we always say we're not the heroes here. It's the clients. It's the people who in their community where they become absolute pariahs are daring to stand up for the unpopular and often deeply hated position of speaking up against majoritarian preferences and bringing in the big bad ACLU to stand up for them. And, we come in and we fight the battle, and then we can go back to New York or to our academic institution, places where civil liberties are not nearly so embattled, but these people have to stay there in communities where they are often reviled. And my goodness, we've had clients who have had their pets killed, who have had their houses burned down. I mean, it's just really, really awful. And the ones that, to me, earn the greatest respect and just awe are young people. We have clients who are, adolescents who are standing up in their middle schools against principals that require them to salute the flag when they don't want to, because they believe that there's not liberty and justice for all because of racial injustice, or who force them to say Christian prayers as a requirement for participating on a football team, or who force them to take a suspicionless drug test, even when there's, no evidence, or, as I said, suspicionless and no evidence about them in particular, as the price for participating in extracurricular activity. And it takes enormous guts, even when the Constitution is on your side, especially when the Constitution is on your side, because you win these cases and then everybody hates you because, you made the school change these really popular policies. Now, I must say, though, that I did, when I look back on my younger self, I did stand up for rights when I was in school myself, and I'm proud of that. I had some teachers who were very supportive. So again, I did have some backing, although I had some teachers who were very hostile. And when I think the earliest that I specifically recall was I was in 7th grade, so that's 12 years old, and a teacher was being attacked for teaching about the Vietnam War, which was then extremely popular. And the teacher didn't say anything that was directly anti-war, but just, showing images of civilians being attacked and their villages burned, that certainly, without any commentary, just let the pictures speak for themselves. And that led to the teacher being, calls for him to be fired, and the local newspaper editorialized that he should be fired. And I actually circulated a petition to support his right and our right to have access to that information. And I had a letter to the editor published in the local newspaper.
Were you always just had the mindset of just get up and do it and take a stand, or did you ever doubt yourself?
Wow, to not doubt yourself sounds incredibly arrogant. I always had the courage to ask questions, and I hope that I would always phrase and I do specifically remember this in engagements with teachers as well as parents. Well, why is it this way? Why shouldn't it be that way? Not presuming that I had the truth, but feeling that, being convinced that I was entitled to an answer. And one of the things that would always drive me crazy from either my parents or teachers, when they would say, it's not your place to ask a question, just do it because we tell you to do it. Do it because it's a rule. I would not accept it. But I would believe that I was open-minded, that if I could be given a rationale for it that was persuasive, that I would be accepting. And this goes into something that I feel so passionately about, Stephanie. Absolutely the most important educational experience I have ever had in my entire life. And this is somebody who's been so privileged to go to Harvard Law School, to go to Harvard College, wonderful universities, wonderful faculty members, wonderful students. But by far the most important educational experience was in middle school and high school in a suburban public high school in Hopkins, Minnesota, a suburb of Minneapolis, being a member of the school debate teams. Because what we did was we truly learned to do our own research, to go into depth, to have different perspectives. We were required to argue both sides of every proposition. You never knew from one debate to the next which side you would be on, and you had to not only analyze problems and criticize problems, you had to come up with what we called a plan for solving that problem. And then you had to have, critique other people's plans and explain why yours was better. And it was just the best introduction to the kind of critical thinking and analysis that I was saying earlier. All of us have to bring to bear on any issue that we face in any capacity, including our capacity as citizens, members of the public, as you say, trying to decide what is the best strategy to protect our own health and what we should advocate for society's health. What is the best approach to social media policy? We should consider many different perspectives and be open-minded, but never hesitate to keep asking more questions, but to be humble enough to acknowledge that we may well be wrong. We may have certain preconceptions that are not justified, or lack of full information, which might change our opinions.
There's so much wisdom and there's so many insights in this conversation. I'm curious if you have a nugget of wisdom that you would share with people listening, young people, older people, people listening who really want to speak their truth and might take all of these awesome insights into account, like asking questions and considering all sides of the argument or conversation. But what would you say to somebody who is a little bit scared to stand up and speak their truth because of backlash or judgment right now in this moment?
And I understand that backlash can be terribly hurtful and even worse, as we have the so-called cancel culture, which has resulted in even people with seemingly powerful established positions being fired from their jobs and having articles withdrawn. To me, the most awful examples, especially when you talk about young people, and as an educator, I'm always concerned about them, Stephanie, are quite a few students who had their acceptances to various colleges retracted because of old social media posts that they made years earlier when they were adolescents, probably in some drunken moment. Can you imagine an adolescent, having beer and then saying something stupid online? Can you imagine that? And it's just such a punitive response to deprive that person of educational opportunities for one stupid thing that they did, which is not at all reflective of the entire human being. And in many cases, they've sincerely apologized for it. The United States Supreme Court, which is hardly a liberal court, has nonetheless struck down the juvenile death penalty and life without parole for juveniles as being inherently unconstitutional, cruel and unusual punishments. And one of the reasons is that brain scientists have a consensus that the brain isn't fully developed until sometime around the mid-20s. So the portions of the brain that are capable of moral reasoning and, the higher cognitive functions. And so that we're even willing to forgive somebody who engages in homicide, but we can't forgive somebody who made a stupid, maybe racist, maybe horribly offensive, but why should that be unforgivable? So yes, you do take a serious risk when you say anything. So you have to be very strategic about planning in advance. I would say making sure that you have people who will be there to back you up, to support you, to spring to your defense when you are subject to intimidation. We've had some recent examples where there were campaigns to try to so-called cancel various people, and Professor Steven Pinker at Harvard was one good recent example where it just fizzled because there was so much support for him and so much opposition to those who were seeking to bring him down. And I think the same thing could be done by a young person. No matter what your view is, there are going to be people who will support you and who will love to have a young person being on the vanguard, right? We saw that recently with the teenager who was arrested for shooting two protesters, right? There are movements online. And I have not had time to delve into the alleged facts in that situation, but I do know that there are, many people on both sides who are raising money, punishing him and supporting, and then to the opposite. So you don't have to do it alone. Now, you also want to live with yourself, and if there's something that you know is wrong, you can make an enormous amount of difference. I mean, look at those young kids in the Parkland school shooting who really got the attention of the entire nation, indeed the entire world, at a very young age. Environmental activists, very, very young people, leading Greta Thunberg being the most well-known, but kids all over the country doing walkouts from their schools. And same thing with Black Lives Matter. They really is driven, and me too. There are so many young people. Each speaking out makes a difference on its own and then becomes part of a larger movement. So you have a lot of role models that should be very encouraging. And the beauty of the internet is that it doesn't matter how young you are. You don't need a lot of money to do this. You don't need any money. Well, you need some to have access to computers. And I'm so supportive of really being sure that everybody has access to not only the technological resources, but the education to use them effectively. That is really such an important responsibility of our society. And this is part of the media literacy and empowering everybody to raise his or her own voice in an effective way, and in a way that is going to reach other people and who will enlarge the support and sympathy for your cause.
I love that. I love that. And yes, to people of all ages, because so many people are coming into themselves, even 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, right? So people, it doesn't matter what age we are, when we have that feeling like we have to say something, we ought to all have access and take a stand for our truth. Thank you. Thank you for modeling what it is to be an unstoppable force for good in this world, Nadine.
Oh, Stephanie, right back at you. And this is such a great platform. I'm honored to be on it.
Thank you. Thanks for joining us on this episode of Catalyst Talks. Stay tuned for what's up next, and please subscribe to our podcast wherever you listen. You'll find those links at catalysttalks.com. Join us. We continue this conversation on social media, and if you'd like to reach out to me privately, you can send me a message at stephanietrager.com. Your attention here means the world to me. Thank you, thank you, thank you.